All right, to talk more about this, we're now being joined by Daniel Rubinstein, who is live from Tel Aviv. He is the current Israeli citizen spokesperson and former advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And thank you very much for talking to us. Let me begin by asking you, this protracted war has gone on for 11 months. With Netanyahu's wall to the back, his back to the wall, what are his options now?
Yes, thank you for having me. For nearly 11 months, Israel has found itself at war, and the Prime Minister has been clear about what the objectives of this war are. The first is the destruction of Hamas in Gaza as a political and military entity. The second is the safe return of all of the hostages. And the third is to ensure that something like the October 7th massacre can never happen again. As far as what the Prime Minister's options are, there's no one who envies his job. He has a very difficult situation, a very difficult negotiation period ahead of him, because what Hamas is essentially demanding as part of a deal to free hostages is to be in the position to be able to carry out another October 7th massacre again. And that's a big part of the reason why there's a holdup and why there hasn't been a deal, because Hamas sees the hostages as insurance so that it will be able to carry out another massacre again at a time and place of its choosing. And that's why we're in this difficult situation with 11 months of war behind us.
But Daniel Rubinstein, that's not what the people of Israel are saying at the moment. They're saying that this war has gone on for too long. If the Israeli government really wanted to bring the hostages back, they could. They went and struck inside another country to kill Ismail Haniyeh. They could surely end this war. They want a deal, and they want it now. Is it possible for Netanyahu to go against public opinion at this point?
Yes, I'd be interested in seeing, first of all, what is the deal that Hamas is proposing? Nothing has been presented by Hamas directly to the Israeli people that gives the Israeli people any indication that Hamas is willing to end its war for good, that Hamas is willing to lay down its arms and not promise to carry out more October 7th massacres again and again. Now, the Israeli public is divided on the issue of emphasis, perhaps. Which of the goals do they emphasize more than the others? Some people will say that we must bring home the hostages at an enormous cost, perhaps even to our future security. And other people will say that our future security is more important than the lives of the hostages. And this is a debate that has no right or wrong or middle ground. The people of Israel really want it all. We want that we will live in safety and security without the threat of Hamas next to us. And what Hamas is demanding as part of a deal is the ability to continue attacking us. Its leaders promise more October 7th attacks again and again. But what happened in recent days was that Hamas executed 6 Israeli hostages while they were in underground tunnels under the city of Rafah. And the Israeli public, first of all, holds Hamas accountable for this barbaric crime, which not just October 7th, but in the treatment of the hostages since then, and certainly the execution of the hostages is Hamas's responsibility. But the people of Israel also look to their prime minister, who has promised to bring the hostages home. And when the hostages are not brought home safely, there are many people who will take to the streets and demand emphasis on the safety of the hostages.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from you is essentially that the option is for a larger full-scale war. I mean, you've already, this war has gone on for this long. 40,000 people are dead on the other side. They're not all Hamas militants. Certainly, there are women and children in it. Your hostages aren't back. Cabinet ministers and opposition leaders are saying the same, that Netanyahu needs to strike some sort of deal. But that clearly doesn't seem to be the path for Netanyahu.
Netanyahu has been open to negotiating some kind of deal that will see the release of hostages. There have been many advisors sent to Doha in Qatar, to Cairo in Egypt. Egypt and Qatar are both mediators for Hamas. We would like to see more pressure from Egypt and from Qatar and from Turkey on Hamas so that Hamas will do the right thing, lay down its arms, and release the hostages. As far as the timing of this war and how much longer this war can go on, we must remember that this is not a war that Israel chose to enter. It is a war that Hamas started, and Hamas is determining that the war will continue because Hamas is promising to annihilate the country of Israel, and it continues to hold hostages. It continues to hold a baby as a hostage. A baby, a mother. Hamas seized toddlers and grandmothers as hostages. It is Hamas that started the war, and it's up to Hamas to determine when this war will end with the release of the hostages and the end of Hamas's rule in Gaza.
But there has to be a quid pro quo for a war to end. For people to come to a negotiating table. You can't be bombing them and then expecting them to come to the talking table. Having said that, what about the Philadelphia corridor? There are cabinet ministers, there are opposition leaders who are saying this is a sticking point that we must stop at. This is something that we shouldn't insist on. What do you think about that?
Yes, there is certainly a debate in Israel about the need for the Israeli military to remain on the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. As you said, it's called the Philadelphia corridor. The question is, why is this corridor so important, and why is Hamas insisting that the Israeli military leave this corridor? It's for the simple reason that this is the corridor through which Hamas acquired a massive stockpile of weapons that it used in the October 7th massacre and that it uses to threaten the people of Israel every single day. So whether they smuggled above ground or through tunnels deep underground, there are many in Israel who say that the only way we can prevent Hamas from rearming and carrying out more massacres and more attacks of the Israeli people is that if we are able to stop this supply of weapons that come from Egypt into Gaza. So I understand that this is a point in the negotiations. Again, as you mentioned, there is a quid pro quo. If Israel were to leave this border and withdraw its soldiers, the people of Israel would like to know, what are they getting in exchange for that? Will Hamas stop attacking Israel and planning to carry out massacres of the Israeli people, or will Hamas use the opportunity to rearm? It's reasonable to assume that Hamas will use this opportunity to try to rearm, because that's why it wants control of the border crossing between Egypt and Gaza.
But several people, several world leaders and several international organizations are also calling what's happening in Gaza a massacre. Isn't that true?
No, I reject this charge entirely. The goals of Israel's war are quite clear, as I mentioned at the beginning. It's the destruction of Hamas as a military and government capability inside Gaza. We have to remember that when Hamas started this war on October 7th, Hamas started this war from densely populated urban areas. It invaded Israel from densely populated urban areas, and it returned to those areas where it continued to fire rockets, anti-tank missiles, mortars, and so on. So Hamas has chosen this battlefield, and Israel is fighting in an urban warfare to the best of its capability to remove this Hamas threat, while taking as much care as possible to separate non-combatants, to give warnings to non-combatants so that they leave a combat zone. But Hamas has made this very difficult by merging itself with civilians. Hamas embeds itself in civilian areas and attacks from those areas. And according to international humanitarian law, if a combatant is using a civilian area for military purposes, that area may become a legitimate military target.
Dan Rubenstein, how many hostages have been killed compared to how many civilians have been killed in Gaza? Do we have the numbers?
How many Israeli hostages have been killed in Gaza? Well, I know that on October 7th, Hamas killed 1,200 people and took 251 hostages back into Gaza. There was a negotiated release of some of the hostages in November. A bit over 100 were released. A number of hostages were murdered in captivity. Beyond that, I don't have specific numbers.
And how many people in Gaza do you think have died in the last 11 months?
The numbers that I've seen are around 15,000 Hamas combatants and around the same number of non-combatants. This is an urban warfare. We're talking about a 1-to-1 ratio of combatant to non-combatant. I wish the number was much lower and only Hamas combatants were being harmed in this war. But as I mentioned, Hamas has chosen the battlefield of urban warfare. It has chosen to embed itself among non-combatants and use them as a shield for its attacks. This makes responding to Hamas quite difficult. If Israel does nothing in response to a Hamas attack from a civilian area, it simply means that Israeli civilians will be massacred in big numbers, and we cannot allow that to happen.
Well, it's certainly an argument that's becoming more and more difficult, not just for Netanyahu to justify to the world, but also internally to its own people. I certainly hope that there can be more conversation about this, and certainly some ceasefire deal and a hostage release deal can come through eventually. Daniel Rubenstein, thanks very much indeed for talking to us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.